Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Timothy. We're still in 1 Timothy chapter 1. Today we're looking at verse 7. Now you recall that we've seen in the last couple of days that Paul began his letter to Timothy by warning Timothy against the danger of false teachers. These who have crept into the congregation and are teaching that which is false doctrine. And this false doctrine is destructive of Christian faith. So he tells Timothy to put a stop to it and to make sure that what you teach is true and sound according to the faith once received. Now, we talked a little bit yesterday about what was involved in some of this false teaching. And one more thing we need to say today is that part of the false teaching that Timothy was dealing with had to do with legalism, which is the idea that in order to be saved, more is required than just faith. More is required than simply believing, but you also must keep the law perfectly. A legalist is one who believes you must keep the law perfectly in addition to faith in order to be saved. Paul always reacted against this emphasis on legalism and considered those who promoted legalism as being false teachers. Now we know that these false teachers Timothy is dealing with had some legalism about them, because in verse 7 Paul says, they want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they are talking about or what they so confidently affirm. So they were teaching something about the law that was incorrect. And that's why we assume, I think correctly, that it was legalism. Same problem we saw when Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians. He was dealing with the legalist. He said, you've got to keep the law. So they obviously come to Timothy's church as well, and were trying to corrupt true Christian faith by saying it's not enough just to believe, but you must observe the law as we will teach you to observe it. In other words, they thought they knew about the law. Paul says they don't. Now, Paul's going to go on in the next paragraph and talk about what the true purpose of the law is. He's going to tell us the law is not meant to be a means by which we save ourselves, but the law is meant to be instruction for those who have been saved by faith. We'll look at that more carefully tomorrow. But right now, he wants to counter this false teaching of these teachers who want to say that it's by legalistic observance that you save yourself. That is wrong. That is incorrect. And Paul speaks against it and tells Timothy to do the same. You know, it's quite clear from what Paul is saying to Timothy that he considered false teaching or false doctrine a great threat to the life of the church. You know, if you look at church history, there are historically two great threats to the life of the church. The church has an enemy, the enemy of our soul, the devil, and he always tries to undermine and attack the church, but he does it basically in two ways. One is the external threat, a threat from outside. And this takes usually the form of some kind of persecution or harassment. This comes from outside the church, persecution against the church. And throughout church history, there have been those times, and they come and they go. There have been those times when the church is persecuted and harassed and threatened and intimidated by outside. That is a threat to the church, and we've had to deal with it throughout history. It is of the enemy. But there's also a second threat to the church that does not come from the outside in persecution, but that comes from the inside in false teaching. This is also of the enemy. This is when the enemy infiltrates the church with those who claim to be teachers, but actually are teaching a doctrine that corrupts the faith. So there's the external threat of persecution, and there is the internal threat of false teaching or heresy. Heresy is simply false teaching that pretends to be true teaching. Now, of these two threats to the life of the church, false teaching is the greatest threat. Listen, we always recognize persecution when it comes. It's tough and it's difficult, but at least we recognize it for what it is. When the church is being persecuted by external forces, we recognize that for what it is. But oftentimes that internal threat of false teaching is not recognized. We don't realize the poison of false doctrine infiltrating the church. And often faith is corrupted by false teaching, and we never realize it's happening because we don't identify teaching as false. So this is why Paul stresses so to Timothy, you must teach true doctrine. You must teach the faith once delivered and protect the congregation against false teachers. In the church today, In the modern church, our greatest threat is false teaching and false doctrine. We must recognize it when it comes, when someone quotes it, and we must hold to the truth, the faith once delivered. Paul emphasizes that to Timothy, and he would emphasize it to us as well. Join us next time for our next session in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Timothy.